Elon Musk pays off bills of baby denied care. Family's reaction is tearful. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the muffled voices spilling in from the hallway. A young couple sat huddled together on a worn bench, the weight of their world pressing down on them like a vice. The woman's hands trembled as she gripped a stack of crumpled papers, her knuckles white from the effort. The man sat beside her, his head bowed and his hands rubbing together nervously as though trying to ward off the chill in the sterile hospital air. The woman, who couldn't have been more than 30, let out a shaky breath. "We can't keep doing this, Mark," she whispered, her voice breaking under the strain. Her eyes darted down to the baby carrier at her feet, where a small, pale infant lay bundled in soft blankets. The baby stirred faintly but didn't cry. He was too weak for that now. Mark looked up, his face tight with exhaustion and frustration. "I know, Emily," he said softly, reaching out to squeeze her shoulder. "But what are we supposed to do? They won't budge. It's all about money to them." Emily pressed her lips together, fighting back tears as she clutched the papers in her lap. Bills, invoices, letters, all demanding payments they couldn't possibly afford. The hospital had been clear: no money, no treatment. It didn't matter that their baby, their precious little boy, was sick. It didn't matter that they were already drowning in debt, selling off their belongings just to stay afloat. To the system, he was nothing more than a line item on a balance sheet. The door across the hallway creaked open, and a nurse stepped out. She was middle-aged, with weary eyes and a name tag that read Margaret. She hesitated for a moment before walking toward them, her expression unreadable. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," she said gently, her voice tinged with pity. "The doctor will see you now." Emily flinched at the tone. She had heard it so many times before, that mixture of sympathy and detachment that always accompanied bad news. Mark stood first, then helped Emily to her feet. She grabbed the baby carrier carefully, cradling it like the most fragile thing in the world as they followed the nurse down the hall. The doctor's office was small and unremarkable, the walls lined with diplomas and generic medical posters. Behind the desk sat Dr. Harris, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses and a neatly pressed lab coat. He looked up as they entered, his expression blank, and gestured for them to sit. Emily set the carrier down on the floor beside her and lowered herself into the chair. Her hands shook as she smoothed the edges of the paperwork, the crumpled corners refusing to flatten. Mark sat beside her, his jaw tight and his fists clenched in his lap. Dr. Harris cleared his throat, flipping through the file in front of him without looking at them. "I'm going to be frank with you," he said, his voice cold and professional. "Your son's condition is critical. He needs immediate treatment, and the longer you wait, the slimmer his chances become." "We know that," Emily said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. We're trying to figure out how to pay for it." Dr. Harris finally looked up, his gaze sharp. "I understand your situation," he said, "but this hospital has policies. If you can't pay, we can't proceed." Mark's face turned red, his hands curling into fists. "So what are we supposed to do?" he demanded, his voice shaking with anger. "Just sit back and watch our son die because we're not rich enough to save him?" Dr. Harris didn't flinch. If anything, his expression grew colder. "I don't make the rules, Mr. Thompson," he said flatly. "This isn't about fairness. It's about resources, and those resources aren't free." Emily let out a strangled sob, her shoulders shaking as she buried her face in her hands. Mark reached for her, his anger faltering as he tried to comfort her. "Emily, don't. Please," he whispered, his voice breaking. The room fell silent except for Emily's quiet cries and the soft, rhythmic sound of the baby breathing in his carrier. Dr. Harris sat back in his chair, watching them with a detached indifference that made Mark's blood boil. "I'm sorry," he said finally, though there was no warmth in his tone. "If you can't pay, I'm afraid there's nothing more we can do." Mark shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the tile floor. "This is insane," he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "You're telling me that you're willing to let a baby die over a stack of bills? Mr. Thompson, I suggest you calm down. Dr. Harris said sharply, his gaze hardening. Yelling won't change the facts. Maybe not, Mark snapped, his chest heaving. But I'm not going to just sit here and let you tell me my son's life doesn't matter. The door opened suddenly, and another figure entered the room. A tall man in a dark suit, with disheveled hair and an air of quiet authority, stepped inside and shut the door behind him. The doctor looked up, startled, but the man didn't seem fazed. "Am I interrupting?" the newcomer asked, his voice calm but firm. Dr. Harris blinked, clearly thrown off by the interruption. "And you are?" he asked stiffly. The man smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "Elon Musk," he said, holding out his hand. "You might have heard of me." Emily and Mark stared at him, their eyes wide. "Elon Musk? Here? In this office?" Dr. Harris's brow furrowed, clearly unimpressed. "I'm not sure what this has to do with you, Mr. Musk," he said. "This is a private matter." "It is," Elon agreed, his gaze shifting to Emily and Mark. "But I think I'll stay." The tension in the small office felt like a vice, squeezing tighter with each passing second. Dr. Harris stared at Elon Musk with a mix of disbelief and irritation, as though unsure whether the man standing before him was some kind of prank or hallucination. Emily clutched the baby carrier tighter, her pulse racing as she exchanged a nervous glance with Mark. It didn't make sense. What was Elon Musk, the billionaire tech mogul, doing here? How could this possibly be real? Dr. Harris cleared his throat, his expression turning stony again. "Mr. Musk," he said coldly, as if tasting something unpleasant, "this is a private meeting. If you're here for some unrelated reason, I suggest you find another room." Elon didn't move. His calm, unbothered demeanor stood in sharp contrast to the storm raging in the Thompsons' hearts. "I'm here for a reason," he replied, slipping his hands casually into his pockets. His tone was steady, almost unnervingly so. "Continue with what you were saying to the Thompsons." Mark shot him a confused look. "What? Why?" Elon raised a hand gently as if to say, "Wait." "Please," he said to Dr. Harris again, his voice clipped but polite. "Don't stop on my account." The doctor's nostrils flared, clearly irritated by the interruption. He turned his cold gaze back to Mark and Emily, as though Elon's presence were an inconvenience at best. "As I was saying," he began sharply, "this is not a charity ward. We can't continue to allocate resources to a patient who has not met the financial requirements. You've been given ample time, and you've exhausted the hospital's goodwill." Emily's lip quivered as she held back tears. "Goodwill?" she choked out. "Is that what you call it? We've sold everything we own. Our car, my grandmother's jewelry, my husband's tools, everything. And you're still telling us it's not enough?" Dr. Harris's eyes remained unmoved, like dull gray stones. "I understand this is difficult for you, Mrs. Thompson," he said, "but medicine costs money. Specialists cost money. The machines, the rooms, the care, it all costs money. Without payment, we can't justify the expense." Mark slammed his hand down on the edge of the doctor's desk, the sound reverberating through the small office. "This is our baby," he roared, his voice cracking. "You're telling me his life is a line item on a balance sheet? Is that what you're saying?" "Mark, stop," Emily whispered, grabbing his arm, though her own voice trembled. "Please." Dr. Harris looked wholly unbothered, as though he'd heard this 1,000 times before. "Mr. Thompson, I don't make the rules. I enforce them. Your son's care requires resources that you do not currently possess." Elon tilted his head slightly, watching Dr. Harris with an expression that was almost amused. He hadn't said another word yet, but his eyes remained locked on the doctor, calm and assessing, as though studying a particularly interesting specimen under a microscope. Mark turned to Elon suddenly, his frustration boiling over. "And you," he snapped, pointing a shaking finger at the billionaire. "What are you doing here? Why are you just standing there? Is this funny to you?" "Mark," Emily whispered again, tugging at his arm, "please don't." But Mark was beyond caring. His face was red with anger, his voice trembling with the weight of helplessness and grief. "You're him, aren't you?" he spat bitterly. "Elon Musk. The guy who builds rockets and buys social media companies. So what? Are you here for a photo op? Here to watch a couple of poor parents lose their child because some suit won't lift a finger. Elon's expression didn't change, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Something sharp and almost dangerous. He said nothing, letting the question hang in the air. "Mark," Emily pleaded, tears streaming down her face now. "Please stop. Just stop." Mark's shoulders slumped as the anger drained out of him, leaving behind only exhaustion and despair. He dropped back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. Emily reached out and touched his shoulder, her own shoulders shaking as quiet sobs escaped her lips. The baby stirred faintly in the carrier, letting out a weak, pitiful cry that seemed to pierce the very air. The sound made Emily flinch, her hand flying to her mouth as her tears fell harder. "He's getting worse," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He's getting worse, Mark. I can't." "What are we supposed to do?" Dr. Harris sighed, glancing at the clock on the wall as though this meeting had gone on too long. "You have until tomorrow morning to arrange payment," he said, his tone brusque. "After that, we will have no choice but to discharge your son." "I'm sorry." The words hit Emily like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She doubled over in her chair, her sobs coming louder now, no longer contained. Mark sat frozen beside her, his face pale and his eyes wide with disbelief. Elon shifted for the first time, his calm, steady voice cutting through the room like a razor. "And if they can't pay?" he asked quietly. Dr. Harris glanced at him, irritated. "Then we discharge the baby," he said. "It's as simple as that." "Simple?" Elon repeated softly, his voice laced with something icy. "You call that simple?" Dr. Harris opened his mouth to respond, but Elon raised a hand, silencing him. "Thank you, doctor," he said, his tone cool and clipped. "I've heard enough." Emily looked up through tear-streaked eyes, her face flushed and exhausted. "What does that mean?" she whispered, her voice shaking. What are you going to do?" Elon didn't answer her. Instead, he turned and looked at Dr. Harris, his expression unreadable but somehow dangerous. "We'll talk later," he said softly, his voice carrying an edge that sent chills down Emily's spine. Dr. Harris frowned but said nothing, clearly unsure how to respond. Elon turned back to Emily and Mark, his gaze softening ever so slightly. "Take care of your son," he said quietly, nodding toward the baby carrier. Emily stared at him, confused and overwhelmed, as Elon turned and strode out of the office without another word. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving behind a stunned silence. Mark finally found his voice, though it was faint and shaky. "What just happened?" he murmured, looking at Emily as though she might have the answers. She shook her head, her tears still falling as she glanced toward the door where Elon had just disappeared. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know." But somewhere, deep in her chest, a flicker of hope stirred. It was small and fragile, but it was there. The sound of the door closing behind Elon seemed to echo through the small office, leaving an awkward silence in its wake. For a moment, no one moved. Emily sat frozen in her chair, her hands still clutching the handle of the baby carrier, her tear-streaked face pale with exhaustion. Mark stared blankly at the desk in front of him, his fists still clenched in his lap. It was as though Elon's departure had drained the room of all air, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating stillness. Dr. Harris let out a long, irritated sigh as he shuffled the papers on his desk. "Well," he said briskly, breaking the silence, "that was unexpected, but it doesn't change anything." Mark's head snapped up, his eyes blazing with anger. "What do you mean it doesn't change anything?" he demanded, his voice sharp and raw. "Did you even hear what that guy said? Do you know who he is?" Dr. Harris adjusted his glasses, his expression unbothered. "I know exactly who he is, Mr. Thompson," he replied coldly. "And it doesn't concern me. Whatever theatrics Mr. Musk is trying to pull here, it doesn't change the facts. Your son's care requires payment. If you cannot provide that payment, then there's nothing more to discuss." "You can't be serious," Mark spat, his voice rising with disbelief. He's Elon Musk. He could buy this entire hospital if he wanted to. Perhaps he could, Dr. Harris said flatly. But he didn't. And until he does, you are still responsible for your child's care. The words hit Mark like a slap to the face. He surged to his feet, his chair skidding backward with a screech of metal on tile. You're a monster, he said through gritted teeth, his voice trembling with fury. You're willing to let a baby die just because we don't have enough zeros in our bank account. Dr. Harris didn't flinch. If anything, his expression grew colder. I understand that this is difficult for you, Mr. Thompson, he said, his tone carefully measured. But I don't make exceptions. The hospital has policies, and those policies must be enforced. Policies? Emily whispered, her voice barely audible as she looked up from the baby carrier. Her eyes were wide and hollow, her face streaked with tears. You're talking about policies while my son, is dying? Dr. Harris looked at her, and for a brief moment, there was something almost human in his expression. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same cold indifference that had defined him from the start. I'm sorry, Mrs. Thompson, he said, his voice devoid of warmth. But my hands are tied. Emily let out a choked sob, her body trembling as she clutched the baby carrier tighter. The baby stirred weakly, his faint cries barely audible over the pounding of Mark's fists against the desk. Do something, Mark roared, his face red with rage and desperation. You can't just sit there and do nothing. He's a baby. For God's sake. Dr. Harris stood slowly, his gaze sharp and unyielding. If you don't calm down, Mr. Thompson, I'll have security escort you out of the building. Mark froze, his chest heaving as he glared at the doctor. You're unbelievable, he said, his voice trembling with fury. You're supposed to be a doctor. You're supposed to save lives. But all you care about is money. Dr. Harris didn't respond. He simply sat back down and returned his attention to the papers on his desk, dismissing the Thompsons with a flick of his pen. The door opened again, and Nurse Margaret stepped inside, her expression tight and weary. Doctor, she said quietly, glancing nervously at Mark and Emily. There's someone here to see you. Dr. Harris didn't look up. I'm busy. It's about Mr. Musk, Margaret said, her voice low but firm. He's waiting outside. Dr. Harris's hand froze mid-signature, and for the first time, a flicker of irritation crossed his face. Again, he muttered under his breath before snapping the pen down onto the desk. Fine. Send him in. Emily and Mark exchanged a bewildered glance as Margaret disappeared down the hall. Mark reached for Emily's hand, his grip firm and reassuring as he whispered, What is going on? Why is he still here? I don't know, Emily replied softly, her voice trembling. But maybe he's trying to help. Mark looked skeptical, but before he could respond, the door swung open and Elon Musk walked back into the office, his hands still tucked casually into his pockets. He wore the same calm, confident expression as before, but there was something different about him now, something sharper, more deliberate. Dr. Harris let out an audible sigh, his frustration evident. Mr. Musk, he said flatly, I thought we were clear. This meeting does not concern you. Elon smiled faintly, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. You were clear, he said smoothly, stepping further into the room. But I don't like being dismissed. Dr. Harris bristled at the remark, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the arms of his chair. I don't know what you're trying to accomplish here, he said through gritted teeth. But unless you're prepared to settle this family's bill yourself, I suggest you leave. Elon tilted his head slightly, his gaze locking onto the doctor's with an intensity that made Emily's heart skip a beat. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Finally, Elon spoke, his voice soft but laced with something dangerous. And what if I am? Dr. Harris blinked, clearly caught off guard. Excuse me? Elon stepped closer, his calm demeanor never wavering. What if I'm prepared to pay their bill? He asked, his voice steady and deliberate. Every penny. Right here, right now. Emily let out a soft gasp, her eyes widening as she stared at Elon in disbelief. Mark froze beside her, his mouth opening and closing as though he couldn't quite process what he had just heard. Dr. Harris, on the other hand, looked unimpressed. "You're serious?" he asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. Elon smiled faintly, slipping his hand into his pocket and pulling out his phone. "Dead serious." Dr. Harris frowned, clearly unsure how to respond. "And why would you do that?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "What's in it for you?" Elon's smile widened, but there was no humor in it. "Does it matter?" Dr. Harris's question hung in the air like a challenge, his sharp, calculating stare fixed on Elon Musk. "What's in it for you?" he repeated, the condescension in his tone unmistakable. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as though he were already analyzing the answer, already looking for a way to dismiss it. Elon tilted his head, his smile never wavering but his eyes narrowing just slightly. "Does there have to be something in it for me?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Or is it so hard for you to believe that someone might want to help simply because they can?" Dr. Harris scoffed, the sound sharp and cynical. "People like you," he said, waving a hand dismissively, "don't do anything without an agenda. You're all the same. Whether it's PR, ego, or power, there's always a reason." Mark's anger flared again, his voice trembling as he snapped, "Are you serious right now? He's offering to help. He's offering to save my son. And you're sitting there questioning his motives?" Dr. Harris's gaze shifted to Mark, his expression hard and unyielding. "Mr. Thompson, I understand that you're desperate, but you do well to understand how the world works. Nothing comes for free." "That's not the point," Mark shouted, standing abruptly. "The point is that my son is dying, and you're too busy playing gatekeeper to care. You sit there in your stupid chair, with your stupid rules, and you act like you're God." "Mark, stop," Emily cried, her voice breaking as she tugged on his arm. "Please." But Mark wasn't listening anymore. His face was flushed with anger, his voice rising as he turned on Dr. Harris. "How do you sleep at night, huh? Knowing that you're letting a baby die because his parents can't scrape together enough cash? What kind of doctor are you?" Dr. Harris's expression darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You're out of line, Mr. Thompson," he said coldly. "I understand that emotions are running high, but if you can't control yourself, I will have you removed from this building." Mark opened his mouth to retort, but Elon's calm voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You really like this power, don't you?" he said quietly, his gaze fixed on Dr. Harris. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made everyone stop and listen. Dr. Harris turned back to Elon, clearly irritated. "Excuse me?" Elon stepped forward, his posture relaxed but his presence suddenly commanding. "This little game you're playing," he continued, holding all the cards, making the decisions, watching people beg. "It makes you feel important, doesn't it?" Dr. Harris's jaw tightened, his face reddening as he stared at Elon. "I don't know who you think you are, but I will not sit here and be insulted." "I think you know exactly who I am," Elon replied, his voice still calm but his gaze unrelenting. "And I think you're used to people being too scared to challenge you. You hide behind your rules and your policies, but at the end of the day, you're just a bureaucrat in a lab coat." Emily watched the exchange with wide eyes, her hands trembling as she reached for Mark's arm. "What's he doing?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "Why is he pushing him like that?" Mark shook his head, his brow furrowed as he watched the scene unfold. "I don't know," he murmured, "but I think he's trying to rattle him." Dr. Harris stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "That's enough," he said sharply, his voice trembling with barely restrained anger. "I don't care who you are or how much money you have. You don't get to walk into my office and question how I do my job." Elon smiled faintly, unbothered by the outburst. "It's not a question of how you do your job," he said evenly. "It's a question of whether you should be doing it." Dr. Harris froze, his face paling as the words hung in the air. The room fell silent again, the tension crackling like static electricity. Emily's breath hitched in her throat as she glanced nervously between Elon and the doctor, unsure of what was going to happen next. "Are you threatening me?" Dr. Harris asked finally, his voice low and dangerous. Elon didn't answer. He simply stared at the doctor, his expression unreadable, as though he were silently daring him to push back further. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity before Dr. Harris finally turned away, his shoulders stiff with anger. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, shuffling through the papers on his desk with jerky, irritated movements. "I don't have time for this nonsense. If you're serious about paying their bill, then put your money where your mouth is. Otherwise, get out of my office." "Elon," Emily said softly, her voice trembling as she looked up at him. Are you serious? Are you really going to help us?" Elon turned to her, his expression softening just slightly. "I told you," he said quietly, "take care of your son. That's all that matters." Emily let out a shaky breath, her tears welling up again as she clutched the baby carrier closer to her chest. Mark sat down beside her, his face pale and his hands shaking as he whispered, "I don't understand what's happening. What is he doing?" "I don't know," Emily replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But maybe he's on our side." Dr. Harris slammed his pen down onto the desk, the sharp sound making everyone jump. "Fine," he snapped, his voice dripping with disdain. "If you want to throw your money away, be my guest. But don't expect me to play along with whatever game you're trying to pull here." Elon smiled faintly, his eyes glinting with something sharp and dangerous. "Don't worry," he said softly. "I'm not playing games. Not with you." The words lingered in the air, their meaning unclear but unsettling. Dr. Harris glared at Elon for a moment longer before turning back to his paperwork, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. Emily and Mark exchanged another bewildered glance, their hearts pounding as they struggled to make sense of what was happening. The baby stirred faintly in his carrier again, letting out another soft, pitiful cry. Emily's chest tightened as she looked down at him, her tears falling silently onto the blanket that covered him. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but for the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope. The air in the office was suffocating, thick with tension that refused to dissipate. Emily wiped her tears hastily with trembling fingers, her gaze darting between Dr. Harris and Elon Musk. Mark sat rigid, his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might snap. The baby stirred again, his faint cry punctuating the silence like a tiny, fragile plea. Dr. Harris rifled through the papers on his desk, pointedly ignoring Elon's steady gaze. He was rattled, but he refused to show it, his movements jerky but deliberate as he sorted through forms. "Mr. Musk," he said finally, his voice tight with forced control, "if you insist on involving yourself in this matter, then I suggest you go through the proper channels. Otherwise, you're only making things worse for this family." Elon didn't flinch. He remained exactly where he was, his hands still tucked casually into his pockets, his expression calm but unreadable. "Making things worse?" he echoed softly, his voice carrying a subtle edge. "I don't see how that's possible. You've already made it very clear where you stand." Dr. Harris's face reddened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of his desk. "I stand where I always stand, with hospital policy. It's not my job to subsidize care for patients who can't pay." Mark shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the tile floor. "Do you even hear yourself?" he shouted, his voice raw with disbelief. "You're talking about my son, our son, like he's just some expense you can cut out of the budget. He's a baby, not a liability." "Sit down, Mr. Thompson," Dr. Harris said sharply, his voice cutting like a knife. "If you can't conduct yourself appropriately, I'll have you escorted out." "Go ahead," Mark snapped, throwing up his arms. "Call security. Have me dragged out of here. At least I'll know I did everything I could to save my son." Emily reached for Mark, her tear-streaked face pale as she tugged on his arm. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't. You're not helping." Mark let out a shaky breath, his shoulders sagging as he sank back into his chair. "This isn't right," he muttered, his voice barely audible. None of this is right. Dr. Harris ignored him, his gaze shifting back to Elon. If you're so determined to play the hero here, Mr. Musk, he said coldly, then put your money on the table. Otherwise, stop wasting everyone's time. Elon smiled faintly, the corners of his lips twitching up in a way that was almost mocking. You seem awfully eager to dismiss me, he said calmly. What's the matter, doctor? Afraid I might actually solve the problem. This isn't about solving problems. Dr. Harris shot back, his voice rising. This is about following procedure. If we start making exceptions, where does it end? Who decides who gets care and who doesn't? The rules exist for a reason. To protect profits, Mark muttered bitterly under his breath. Dr. Harris turned on him sharply. To ensure sustainability, he corrected, his voice icy. This hospital can't function if we're handing out free care to every family that walks through the door. Emily's breath hitched, her chest tightening as fresh tears welled in her eyes. So what are we supposed to do? She asked softly, her voice breaking. Just let him die? Dr. Harris didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence was enough. Emily buried her face in her hands, her sobs muffled as Mark wrapped an arm around her, his own face pale and stricken. The baby let out another faint cry, the sound so weak it was barely audible. It was as though the life was already slipping away from him, one soft breath at a time. Elon watched the scene unfold, his expression unreadable as his gaze flicked between the Thompsons and Dr. Harris. For a moment, it seemed as though he might say something, might finally break his silence and step in. But he didn't. He simply stood there, still and silent, as though waiting for something. Dr. Harris let out another frustrated sigh, shaking his head as he pulled a fresh stack of papers from his drawer. If you can't pay, then I'm afraid we're done here, he said flatly, sliding the forms across the desk toward Mark. This is the discharge paperwork. I'll give you an hour to gather your things. Emily looked up sharply, her face streaked with tears. Discharge, she choked out, her voice trembling. You're sending us home? Now? Dr. Harris didn't meet her gaze. Your son is stable for the moment, he said briskly. But without treatment, that won't last. I'm sorry, Mrs. Thompson, but my hands are tied. Emily's sobs grew louder, her shoulders shaking as she buried her face in her hands again. Mark stared at the papers on the desk, his face pale and hollow as he reached for them with trembling hands. You can't do this, he whispered, his voice shaking. You can't just send him home to die. It's not a choice I'm making, Dr. Harris said stiffly, his voice devoid of emotion. It's the reality of the situation. Elon finally moved, stepping forward and placing a hand gently on Mark's shoulder. The gesture was small, but it carried a surprising weight, like the calm before a storm. Mark looked up at him, his eyes filled with confusion and desperation. Why are you just standing there? He whispered hoarsely. You said you were going to help. You said, trust me, Elon said softly, his voice low but firm. Just trust me. Mark stared at him for a long moment, his brow furrowing as he tried to make sense of the words. Emily looked up, her tear-streaked face filled with confusion as her gaze shifted to Elon. What do you mean? She whispered. What are you going to do? Elon didn't answer. He turned back to Dr. Harris, his expression unreadable but somehow sharper now, as though a decision had been made. An hour, Dr. Harris repeated, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Gather your things. Elon smiled faintly, his eyes glinting with something dangerous. We'll see, he said quietly. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the faint rustling of papers and the weak cries of the baby from his carrier. The silence felt alive, like a storm about to break. Mark and Emily sat frozen, the discharge forms sitting between them like a death sentence. Dr. Harris, back to his detached professionalism, scribbled notes on a file, his cold indifference sharper than any blade. Elon, however, remained where he was, perfectly still. His calm demeanor hadn't wavered, but now there was something sharper about him, something intentional. When he spoke, his voice was soft but clear, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. You've made your position very clear, Dr. Harris, Elon said quietly. But now I'm going to make mine. Dr. Harris didn't look up. Mr. Musk, I've already told you. Elon cut him off with a single, sharp word. Stop. The room froze. The authority in Elon's voice was undeniable, like a switch had been flipped, turning the calm observer into something far more commanding. Dr. Harris looked up, startled, as though realizing for the first time who, exactly, he was dealing with. Mark and Emily exchanged bewildered glances, their confusion deepening with each second. Elon stepped forward, his movements deliberate and unhurried. His gaze locked on Dr. Harris like a predator cornering its prey. I've been patient, he said, his voice steady but firm. I've listened to you dismiss this family's pain. I've watched you hide behind policies and procedures, pretending that you're powerless when the truth is you're not. You just don't care. Dr. Harris's face reddened, and he spluttered indignantly. I won't be lectured by you, Mr. Musk, he snapped, rising to his feet. This is my hospital, and I will not have you coming in here, undermining my authority. Elon held up a hand, and the room fell silent again. Your hospital? He echoed, tilting his head slightly. That's where you're wrong, Dr. Harris. Because as of 30 minutes ago, this hospital belongs to me. Dr. Harris froze, his mouth open mid-sentence. What? Mark and Emily blinked in stunned confusion, as though they couldn't quite process what they had just heard. Emily whispered faintly, What did he say? Elon smiled faintly, the glint of something dangerous flickering in his eyes. I said, he repeated, his voice even and unshakable, this hospital belongs to me. I just bought it. The room erupted into chaos. Dr. Harris's face turned beet red, and he slammed his hands onto the desk. You can't be serious, he shouted, his voice cracking. This is a joke. This is insane. Elon's smile didn't waver. It's not a joke. The paperwork is being finalized as we speak. He turned to Nurse Margaret, who had reappeared in the doorway, looking as though she'd seen a ghost. Margaret, he said calmly, please confirm that I've been in contact with the board of directors for the last hour. Margaret stammered, her eyes darting nervously between Elon and Dr. Harris. Why yes, she managed finally. The board received an offer earlier today. It was approved. Dr. Harris staggered back, his face pale with shock. This is impossible, he muttered, shaking his head as though trying to wake from a nightmare. You can't just buy a hospital. It doesn't work like that. Elon raised an eyebrow, his calm smile widening. You'd be surprised what's possible when you have enough money. Dr. Harris, Mark let out a breathless, disbelieving laugh, running a hand through his hair as he turned to Emily. Did he just say he bought the hospital? Emily stared at Elon, her mouth open, her eyes brimming with tears of disbelief. Why? She whispered, her voice trembling. Why would you do that? Elon turned to her, his expression softening as he gestured toward the baby carrier at her feet. Because no child should ever be denied care, he said simply. Not when there's something that can be done. Dr. Harris was livid now, his hands shaking as he pointed an accusatory finger at Elon. This is ridiculous. You think you can come in here and buy your way to heroism? That's not how medicine works. You can't just... Elon cut him off with a sharp glare, his voice dropping an octave. Don't lecture me about how things work, doctor, he said, his tone deadly calm. You had a choice. You could have helped this family. You could have done the right thing. But instead, you chose to hide behind policies and profit margins. So now, I'll make sure this hospital operates differently. Dr. Harris's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. You have no right. I have every right, Elon snapped, his voice cutting through the doctor's protests. Because I own this hospital now. And the first thing I'm going to do is make sure the Thompson family gets the care they need. Free of charge. Emily let out a strangled sob, her hands flying to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. Mark stood abruptly, his eyes wide and disbelieving. You're serious? He choked out. You're really doing this? Elon turned to him, his expression softening again. Yes, he said simply. Your son will get the care he needs. You don't have to worry anymore. Mark staggered back into his chair, his hands shaking as he ran them over his face. "Oh my God," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Dr. Harris looked as though he might explode, his face red with rage and humiliation. "You'll ruin this hospital," he shouted. "You think you're some kind of savior, but you're not. You're a fool." Elon turned back to him, his expression steely and unyielding. "No, Dr. Harris," he said quietly. "I'm not the fool here. You are. Because you forgot what it means to be a doctor. You forgot why you started this job in the first place." Dr. Harris froze, his face pale as the weight of Elon's words sank in. He looked small now, diminished. A man who had been stripped of the authority he once wielded like a weapon. Elon turned back to Mark and Emily, his gaze warm and reassuring. "Your son will be fine," he said softly. "I'll make sure of it." Emily let out a shaky breath, tears of relief streaming down her face as she whispered, "Thank you. Thank you so much." Elon nodded, his expression softening further. "Take care of your son," he said quietly. "He's what matters most." Dr. Harris stood frozen, his face pale and slack, as if someone had pulled the ground out from under him. His eyes darted around the room, first to Elon Musk, then to Nurse Margaret, and finally to the Thompsons, searching for some shred of control, some way to regain his footing. But there was none. "You can't," he started, his voice trembling with indignation. "You can't just buy your way into this hospital and tell me how to run things. This is absurd." Elon's gaze didn't waver. His hands were still casually in his pockets, but the calm facade now carried a quiet finality, one that made it clear the conversation was over. "I didn't buy my way in," he said softly. "I bought the hospital. There's a difference." Nurse Margaret, standing awkwardly by the door, cleared her throat as she stepped forward. "Dr. Harris," she said hesitantly, her voice shaking, "the board has already confirmed Mr. Musk's ownership. It's done." Dr. Harris's face turned crimson, his anger spilling over. "And what about my authority?" he snapped, turning to Margaret as though desperate for someone, anyone, to back him up. "You're just going to let this outsider come in here and undo everything we've worked for?" Margaret hesitated, glancing nervously between Elon and the doctor. Her voice was small but steady when she replied, "With all due respect, Doctor, maybe it's time someone did undo things. This family shouldn't have had to suffer like this." Her words hit like a slap. Dr. Harris's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He looked utterly lost, as though the walls of his carefully constructed authority were crumbling around him, brick by brick. The Thompsons watched the scene in stunned silence, their tears of despair slowly giving way to something else, relief. Mark rose shakily to his feet, his voice raw as he turned to Elon. "Is this really happening?" he asked, his words barely audible. "Are you serious? You bought the hospital for us?" Elon turned to face him, his expression softening again. "I didn't buy it for you," he said gently. "I bought it because this kind of thing shouldn't happen to anyone. No parent should have to beg to save their child." Emily let out a choked sob, her hands flying to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. She turned to Mark, her voice trembling as she whispered, "He saved our son. Mark, he saved our son." Mark sank back into his chair, his head in his hands as his shoulders shook with silent tears. The weight of the last few days, the hopelessness, the anger, the desperation, crashed down all at once, leaving him too overwhelmed to speak. Dr. Harris, meanwhile, was unraveling. His hands trembled as he slammed a fist down on his desk. "This isn't how it works," he shouted, his voice shaking with fury. "Hospitals don't run on charity. You'll bankrupt this place within a year." Elon raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor making the doctor's outburst seem all the more ridiculous. "I think you underestimate how deep my pockets go, Doctor," he said evenly. "And let me make one thing clear. This hospital isn't going to be run the way you ran it." Dr. Harris pointed a shaking finger at Elon, his voice hoarse with desperation. "You think you're a hero? You think throwing money at this place will solve its problems? You're naive. You don't understand how hospitals work, how the real world works. Elon took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, steely calm. I understand more than you think, he said. I understand that for you, patients are numbers on a spreadsheet. I understand that you'd rather let a baby die than bend your precious rules. But that ends today. This hospital will treat people like human beings, not line items. Dr. Harris staggered back a step, as though Elon's words had physically struck him. His face was a mask of humiliation, his authority crumbling further with every second. He opened his mouth to argue again, but this time Nurse Margaret stepped forward, her voice firmer than before. Dr. Harris, she said sharply, that's enough. He turned to her, shocked, as though unable to believe she'd spoken against him. Margaret, you don't understand. No, she interrupted, shaking her head. I do understand. I've watched families suffer because of your decisions. I've watched parents cry just like the Thompsons while you hid behind policies and procedures. Mr. Musk is right. This isn't about rules. It's about doing what's right. The room fell silent again, the weight of Margaret's words hanging heavy in the air. Dr. Harris looked at her as though she'd betrayed him, his face pale and slack. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. He had no more arguments left to give. Finally, Elon turned to Mark and Emily, his voice softening as he addressed them. Your son will get the best care this hospital can provide, he said gently. I've already spoken to the board. They're bringing in the top specialists. Everything your baby needs. Emily let out another sob, her hand flying to her mouth as she looked at Elon with wide, tear-filled eyes. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know how we'll ever repay you. You don't need to, Elon replied, shaking his head. Just take care of your son. That's all I ask. Mark stood and took Elon's hand, shaking it firmly as tears streamed down his face. You saved his life, he said hoarsely. You saved our lives. Thank you. Thank you so much. Dr. Harris slumped into his chair, defeated. His gaze was fixed on his desk, his face pale and hollow. The man who had once seemed so unshakable, so untouchable, now looked small and insignificant, stripped of the power he had wielded so carelessly. Nurse Margaret turned to Elon, her voice soft but full of gratitude. Thank you, she said, for all of this. You've done more for this family, and for this hospital, than anyone ever has. Elon nodded, his expression calm as he turned back to Emily and Mark. Go see your son, he said softly. He's waiting for you. Mark and Emily exchanged tearful glances before gathering their things, Emily cradling the baby carrier carefully as they moved toward the door. As they left, Emily glanced back at Elon one last time, her voice trembling as she whispered, You're an angel. A real-life angel. Elon smiled faintly, but said nothing. As the door closed behind the Thompsons, Dr. Harris sat slumped at his desk, staring blankly ahead. Elon turned to Nurse Margaret, his voice calm but firm. Get the specialists on the phone, he said. Make sure they're ready to start immediately. Yes, Mr. Musk, Margaret replied, her voice full of newfound resolve. Elon turned back to Dr. Harris one last time, his voice low and sharp. I hope you learned something today, Doctor, he said softly, because this is your last day in charge. Dr. Harris didn't respond. He couldn't. Dr. Harris sat slumped in his chair, staring blankly at his desk. The weight of his humiliation hung over him like a storm cloud, his authority shattered, his career in ruins. For so long, he'd ruled this hospital with cold efficiency, his policies sacrosanct, his decisions unquestioned. But in a single day, everything had come undone. The door opened quietly, and Nurse Margaret stepped inside, holding a small folder in her hands. Doctor, she said softly, her tone stripped of the deference it once held. The board has decided to place you on immediate leave pending a formal review. Dr. Harris looked up, his face pale and drawn. They can't do this, he whispered, though there was no conviction in his voice. I built this hospital, kept it running. Margaret's gaze was steady, unflinching. You kept it running for profit, Doctor, she replied firmly. Not for the people who needed it most. That's not what medicine is about. Outside the office, the world was changing. Mark and Emily sat in the neonatal care unit, watching as the top specialist Elon had promised tended to their baby. Machines beeped rhythmically, the sound now a reassurance instead of a death knell. Emily clutched Mark's hand tightly, tears of relief streaming down her face as she whispered, "He's going to be okay." Mark nodded, his voice thick with emotion. He's going to be okay because someone cared enough to step in. Someone who didn't have to. From the hallway, Elon watched quietly, his hands still in his pockets. There was no grand declaration, no need for attention or applause. He had done what he came to do. The Thompsons would get their miracle, and a cruel system had been exposed for what it was. Nurse Margaret stepped beside Elon, her voice low as she said, "You've changed this hospital forever. For the better." Elon glanced at her, offering a faint smile. "Let's hope so," he said quietly, "because change is long overdue." And now, YouTube viewers, it's over to you. How many times have we heard stories like this? How many families have been turned away because they couldn't afford care? Because someone in power decided their lives didn't matter? Dr. Harris isn't just one man. He's a reflection of a larger problem. But Elon Musk in this story represents something else. The power of intervention, the power of doing what's right. So here's the real question. What would you do if you had the power to change someone's life? Would you look the other way like Dr. Harris, hiding behind policies and procedures? Or would you step in like Elon and remind the world that sometimes doing what's right is worth everything? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, change doesn't always start with money. It starts with you.